This year marks the 30th anniversary of the release of The Empire Strikes Back. Considered by many to be the best Star Wars movie, it had rich characters, a grand emotional scale, classic romance, and a lot of fun despite its darker tone. In other words, it was everything that many of the other Star Wars movies couldn't be. And Kel Surprise, it was the one that George Lucas had the least involvement in. So to mark that occasion, I'm going to revisit my bashing of George Lucas's stupidity, this time by going after his many revisions of the Star Wars franchise. Number 1. Greedo shooting first. Let's just get this one out of the way now. For anyone too young to have seen the original non-CGI'd versions of the first movie, I'll explain. In the scene where Greedo the bounty hunter corners Han over his debt to Jabba the Hutt, the big payoff to Han playing with his gun under the table was that the smuggler shoots Greedo right when the Rodian thinks he has a drop on him. For some reason, Lucas thought that despite Greedo pointing a gun at Han the whole time, this made Harrison Ford's character look like a cold-blooded killer, so in the special edition and DVD releases they added a laser blast coming from Greedo before being shot by Han. Now, never mind that this totally robs the scene of its thrills, and basically steals the punchline from a good joke, the addition is totally unbelievable. Greedo is supposed to be a professional assassin, isn't he? So why the hell can't he hit a guy 4 feet in front of him in a well-lit bar? I can throw a dart better than that, and I'm barely coordinated at all. Possibly the most insulting part about all of this is that even though no one liked the change, Lucas never bothered to put it back the way it was in later updates. You would think that a guy who is now more businessman than artist would have the common courtesy to listen to his customers, but evidently that's too small of a priority for him. Number 2. The invasion of Anakin's scene chewer. Another change that caused a lot of controversy happened in the DVD release of Return of the Jedi, specifically in the scenes where Darth Vader redeemed himself and became Anakin Skywalker again. While Sebastian Shaw's performance as a dying Anakin was left more or less untouched, for some reason they replaced his Force Ghost appearance with Hayden Christensen, who portrayed the character in episodes 2 and 3. Once again, this is a change that no one got and no one wanted. I can understand making Sebastian Shaw look younger, since George Lucas had the wonderful idea to make Anakin a kid in the prequels instead of closer to Obi-Wan's age like he was in the classic films, so I can understand erasing some aging from Shaw's face, or maybe even replacing his head with stock footage from an earlier movie, but replacing him completely with this sociopathic brat? Especially since this was never explained by the story at any time. On top of that, Hayden Christensen still plays a part with one of his creepy Norman Bates looks. Didn't someone explain to him that he's supposed to be acting proud of his son? Yeesh, I wasn't this bothered about Vader's parenting when he chopped his kid's hand off. Number 3. Yes, Virginia, there's still a Naboo. Sorry. A smaller but still odd revision, still on the end of Jedi, was a brief visit to Naboo after the Empire is defeated. This even comes complete with a Gungan, possibly even Jar Jar, shouting, "We set free!" Again, why? The version of the sequence that was in the special edition I liked just fine. This tacked-on edition, just for the sake of a prequel reference, throws the whole rhythm off, and frankly, I'm not sure anyone really cared. Let me put it this way. We already know that the galaxy, especially in Star Wars, is a really big place. There are lots of worlds in the prequels, the Clone Wars spin-offs, the novels, the games that don't appear in the original trilogy. Granted, some of that was simply because the stories concerning them weren't written yet, but a lot of that is also because they don't need to be in those films. Frankly, it's as much of a fan rank as the so-called subplot with Chewbacca was in Episode 3, except that was with a character the fans actually liked. Finally, this is, once again, Lucas ignoring his audience and sugar daddies. The fans have made it abundantly clear that they hate Jar Jar and everything to do with him. Lucas seemed to get that when he made Jar Jar's parts smaller and smaller in Episodes 2 and 3 to the point where he barely appeared at all. Then, just to flip off the audience, he tacks Jar Jar into the end of the last bearable movie in the series. Where's Boba Fett when you need him? Alright, number 4, CG Overkill. Okay, having bashed the special editions a lot, I should say that there is some changed stuff that I liked. The Battle of Yavin looks a lot better. The new scene with Biggs was a nice touch. Opening up Bespin was a nice idea, at least on paper, if not in the effects. But some of the changes either overdid a good idea or were just totally unnecessary. Let's start with Boba Fett's resting place in the movies, the Sarlacc monster. I can understand wanting to make the thing a little bit more alive, so the tentacles are fine by me. But what's with the beak? That toothy orifice worked just fine as a mouth, and that's how the big action scene around it was filmed. Adding the beak was not only redundant, but it meant that the poor CG guys had to come up with a way to have stuntmen from 1982 fall into a monster that no one planned on back then. To add insult to injury, they kill the funniest part of that scene because it still comes out of the original hole rather than the new beak. Wasn't anyone thinking when they put this thing there? A similar problem is the expanded Mos Eisley in the original movie. In general, I like the idea, gratuitous slapstick aside, But where it really became a problem for me was when they stopped for a dialogue scene but still add this digital junk into the background. This is a point where the audience really needs to know what's going on, but they will probably miss it because they're spotting all the new droids and creatures that Uncle George dropped in for the Ritalin market. And then there's number 5, Jabba the Butt. Easily the most hyped change in the special edition of the first movie was restoring and completing a scene where Han ran into Jabba just before he, Luke, etc. left on their adventure. Now, never mind that they never quite made Jabba look like he did in Return of the Jedi, a couple of things about the scene have always bugged me. For one thing, the digital Jabba never quite worked. It's one thing to add a creature to a scene that was filmed with that creature in mind, but when they shot the original scene in the 70s, they clearly had a completely different design for Jabba than what eventually appeared, specifically something a lot smaller. If you look closely, you can see Han's hands and body passing through Jabba many times during the scene, and not only that, but the scene barely acknowledges that he has a 15-foot-long tail that would trip up everyone in the scene every time Jabba turns around, which he does a lot.
Laugh it up, fuzzball.
There's simply no way that a creature that big would be this maneuverable. Then there's its place in the story. If you pay any attention to the dialogue, Han's discussion with Jabba is almost identical to his discussion with Greedo. In fact, Harrison Ford's line reads are almost exactly the same for both scenes.
Even I get bored sometimes. Do you think I had a choice?
Even I get bored sometimes. You think I had a choice?
I haven't read the original script, but this and the novelization, which I have read, make me think that the Greedo scene originally had very different lines, and when the Jabba scene had to be scrapped, they just moved Han's lines to the bar scene. This is covered very well by the fact that Han's duplicate lines are all off-camera, and Greedo speaks an alien language, so he can say whatever the subtitles want him to say. Yet for whatever reason, when they restored the Jabba scene, they never restored the original lines to the Greedo scene. Either they couldn't find those lines, or Lucas thought that making Greedo the worst marksman in the galaxy was more important. So we have two scenes, pretty much back-to-back, that are carbon copies of each other. Every editor in the movie business knows that when you have that situation, you should cut one of the scenes out. And frankly, the Jabba scene was never that big of a deal. He was always more interesting when referred to prior to finally being shown in Return of the Jedi. It's called mystery, George. That's what good storytellers try to create. Now look, I'm not here to totally bash artists wanting to revise their own work. Sometimes there are just things you aren't able to do the first time around, and I totally support getting your vision out there, or just fixing mistakes that were there the first time around. But what we saw in the special editions and DVD versions of the old Star Wars movies went beyond that into an exercise of CG insanity for those with attention deficit disorder. And of course, if there's any doubt that these were also testbeds for the prequels, you just need to look at nearly any scene in The Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, or Revenge of the Sith to see the exact same thing now taking up entire feature-length films, and being a lot less interesting. That's why A New Hope, The Empire Strikes Back, and even Return of the Jedi will always be classics, while the prequels will be the awkward stepchildren that no one wants to talk about. That's it for me.